Find somewhere comfortable, somewhere soft and warm. You don't need to follow any of this closely. You don't need to remember a single word. Just let the sounds arrive, the way water finds its way through stone, slowly, without effort, without any particular destination in mind. If today was hard, you can set it down now. Tonight we're going somewhere very still, somewhere the sun has never reached. We're going underground, into the vast and patient dark that lives beneath the world we walk on every day. Into caves, into the deep, unhurried quiet where an entirely different kind of life has been slowly unfolding for millions of years. There is nothing to understand tonight, nothing to solve or remember, only something to wonder at, gently, from the warmth of wherever you are. The cave is already waiting. It has been waiting, in fact, for longer than we can comfortably imagine. So we are in no hurry at all. Somewhere beneath the rolling hills of Romania, there is a cave that has been sealed from the surface world for perhaps 5 million years. Not partially sealed, not occasionally visited, completely closed, a pocket of the earth that the sky simply forgot about. When scientists finally broke through to it in 1986, they found something that quietly rearranged everything they thought they knew about life. Inside, in the total and absolute dark, in air thick with hydrogen sulfide that would be poisonous to most creatures, there was a world. 48 species, most of them found nowhere else on Earth. Spiders and water scorpions and centipedes and beetles and small ghostly isopods, all going about their lives in the permanent midnight, in a cave that had been cut off from sunlight since long before our earliest ancestors walked upright. The cave is called mobile, and what keeps it alive is not sunlight at all. At the base of its food chain, instead of plants drinking in the sun, there are bacteria. Ancient, patient bacteria that draw their energy from sulfur, from the chemical darkness of the earth itself. They pull hydrogen sulfide up from the rock and transform it into something living, something that can be eaten, something that becomes, in time, the whole complex architecture of a world. It is called chemosynthesis, and it is the cave's quiet miracle. Life building itself entirely from the inside out, with no reference to the star 93 million miles above. When you think about that, really sit with it, something softens. The idea that life requires sunlight, that warmth and brightness are the conditions for existence, turns out to be only one version of the story. Down in the dark, in the patience of the stone, life found another way entirely. And mobile is not alone. Beneath every continent, beneath mountains and meadows and city streets, there are cave systems of extraordinary depth and reach. Some of them stretch for hundreds of miles. Some of them have never been fully mapped. And in almost all of them, if the conditions are even remotely hospitable, something lives. Scientists who study these creatures have a word for the ones who have truly committed to the underground life. They call them troglobites. It comes from the Greek trogl, meaning hole or cave, and bios, meaning life, cave life. True cave life. True cave life. These are the animals that have not merely visited the dark, but have given themselves over to it entirely, generation after generation, across spans of time so long they make history feel like an afternoon. Troglobites cannot survive outside their caves. The surface world, with its changing temperatures and its light and its open predatory sky, would undo them. They have traded all of that away slowly across countless generations in exchange for something else entirely. The temperature in many deep caves holds steady year-round, sometimes for thousands of years, varying by only a degree or two. No seasons reach down here. No storms. no droughts. No droughts. The air is still. The dark is absolute. And in that extraordinary sameness, evolution has done some of its most patient and peculiar. The first thing most troglodytes lose is their eyes. Not all at once, not in a single dramatic step, but slowly across generations, as those animals that happened to be born with slightly smaller eyes survived just as well as those with fully developed ones. Better, even, because eyes are expensive. They require energy to build and maintain. In a cave where food is scarce and every calorie matters, an eye that cannot see in the dark is a luxury the body eventually stops affording. What fills the space left by vision is something more interesting. The other senses sharpen and expand in ways that feel almost like compensation, though evolution doesn't plan or compensate. It simply selects what works. Cave animals often develop dramatically elongated antennae, extra sensitive to the faintest vibrations in air and water. They grow more taste buds than their surface relatives. They develop additional sensory cells along their bodies that can detect the tiniest pressure changes in the water around them, reading the cave's invisible currents, the way we might read a room. The blind Mexican cavefish is one of the most studied examples of this quiet transformation. It belongs to the same species as a sighted riverfish that still lives in the sunlit waters of Mexico and Texas. They can even interbreed, which tells you how recently, in geological terms, their paths diverged. But the cave-dwelling version has been remodeled by darkness in ways that go far beyond the loss of eyes. Its lateral line system, a row of sensory cells running along its body that detects water movement, has been expanded and refined to an extraordinary degree. The cavefish essentially sees with its entire body, reading the water around it like a map. There is something lovely in that. The idea that when one way of perceiving the world closes, the whole body quietly opens to another. And then there is the question of pigment. Most troglodytes are pale. Some are almost translucent. You can see their organs through their skin, faint and soft as watercolor. This, too, is the cave's quiet economy. Pigment, like eyes, costs energy to produce. Melanin, the compound that gives skin and fur and scales their color, requires resources to make. In a world without light, there is no sun to protect against, no camouflage to maintain. And so, generation by generation, the color fades. The cave creatures become ghostly, luminous, strange, beautifully adapted to a world that has no use for color at all. These are not deficiencies. If troglodytes have given themselves completely to the underground life, there is another group of creatures that has found a more negotiated arrangement. Scientists call them troglophiles, cave lovers. Animals that can live their entire lives in caves if they choose to, but whose relatives still inhabit the surface world in similar dark, damp environments. Beetles and worms and certain salamanders and crayfish fall into this category. And then there are the trogloxines, the cave guests. Animals that use the cave for shelter or rest, but must return to the surface to feed. Of all the cave guests, bats are perhaps the most familiar. On summer evenings, millions of them pour out of cave mouths at dusk, great dark rivers of wings and echolocation, filling the warm air above fields and rivers and forests. Some caves shelter colonies of extraordinary size. Bracken. Texas is home to perhaps 20 million Mexican free-tailed bats, one of the largest concentrations of mammals on Earth. As evening falls, they emerge in a spiral column visible from miles away. A living tornado of creatures heading out to feed on insects, consuming thousands of tons of them each summer night. The cave is their anchor, their safe and constant home. They return before dawn, folding themselves back into the dark, hanging upside down in the cool silence, their small hearts slowing, their breathing dropping to nearly nothing in the deep rest of the day. Bats are extraordinary navigators of darkness, using sound the way we use sight, sending out pulses of ultrasonic noise and reading the returning echoes to build a precise and detailed picture of the world around them. In a crowded cave with millions of voices bouncing off stone walls, they can still locate their own pup among the thousands. The cave does not confuse them. It is home, and home is always legible. There is also the cave cricket, a creature with a somewhat different relationship to the dark. Cave crickets are troglodytes, venturing out from caves at night to forage for food on the forest floor, eating fallen leaves and fungi and whatever else they can find. But their time outside is dangerous. Predators are everywhere in the surface world, and the cave cricket is not fast. So evolution has given it a solution that is almost comical in its elegance. The cave cricket has a distensible crop, a storage organ that allows it to eat more than its own body weight in a single extended meal. It goes out, it eats enormously, and then it retreats back into the safety of the cave, where it can live off its reserves for weeks without needing to expose itself again. It is, in essence, a creature that has learned to binge strategically, to take the surface world's abundance in great slow mouthfuls and then disappear back into the patient dark to digest in peace. There is something almost restful in that image, the idea of retreating into stillness after the effort of the day, carrying what you need and then going somewhere quiet and safe to process it slowly. The cave, for all these creatures, is not a prison or a last resort. It is a sanctuary, a place of reliable shelter in a world that offers very little that is reliable. The darkness, which might seem to us like deprivation, is to them a kind of gift, a stable, unchanging haven where the temperature never swings and the predators of the open world cannot easily follow. Of all the creatures that have made their home in caves, perhaps none is more quietly extraordinary than the Ohm. It is a salamander, pale as milk, almost translucent, with a flattened body and tiny vestigial eyes hidden beneath the skin like something half-remembered. It lives in the cold underground rivers and lakes of the Dinaric karst, a vast limestone region stretching through Slovenia and Croatia and Bosnia, where the rock is riddled with water-carved passages and chambers. The Ohm has lived there, in that cold, dark water, for so long that it has become something almost mythological. For centuries, local people in the region had no explanation for it. When heavy rains flushed Ohms out of cave springs and into daylight, they seemed to emerge from nowhere, pale and strange and clearly not of the surface world. Some people believed they were the offspring of cave dragons, baby dragons washed out by the floods. The Ohm's scientific name, Protea sanguinus, even carries a trace of that mythology. Proteus was a shape-shifting sea god in Greek mythology, ancient and elusive. The reality of the Ohm is, if anything, more astonishing than the legend. An Ohm can live for more than 100 years. A century. In a creature roughly the length of a human hand, that is an almost incomprehensible lifespan. For comparison, most salamanders on the surface live for 10 to 20 years at most. The Ohm stretches time in a way that defies easy understanding. Part of the answer lies in the cave's extraordinary stability. The Ohm lives in water that stays at around 10 degrees Celsius year-round, never warmer, never colder. Its metabolism, already slow by the standards of the surface world, has slowed further still in response to the cold and the scarcity of food. It moves very little. It eats when it can, and, when it cannot, it simply waits. One olm was observed by researchers remaining almost completely motionless for 2,569 days. That is more than 7 years. In the same spot, in the same cold, dark water, barely moving. Not sleeping exactly, not hibernating in the way we might understand it, but simply existing at the lowest possible intensity. A life turned down almost to silence, waiting with the patience of stone for conditions to change. When food does arrive, a small crustacean, a waterworm, the olm can eat enough to sustain itself for months. It stores energy as fat, and it can reabsorb non-vital tissue when truly necessary, the body quietly consuming itself from the inside to keep the essential parts running. It is a kind of biological austerity that is almost meditative in its discipline. The olm also reproduces with extraordinary slowness. It may not reach sexual maturity until it is 15 or 16 years old. A female lays only a small number of eggs, perhaps 30 or 40 in a clutch, and she guards them carefully for months in the cold, dark water. Each egg is large and rich with nutrients, a significant investment. The cave's logic is always the same. When resources are scarce, invest deeply in fewer things. Some Alabama cave crayfish follow a similar path. They can live for 80 years and they may not reproduce until they are 40. 40 years of life before the first offspring. On the surface, where predators are plentiful and winters are hard and life burns fast, such slowness would be fatal. In the cave, where the conditions barely change and the predators are few, it is simply the right answer. There is something deeply calming in this idea. The cave teaches a different relationship to time, not the urgent, compressed time of the surface world, where everything must happen quickly before winter comes or the predator arrives, but a vast, unhurried time where life can unfold at the pace of water moving through limestone. Patient, persistent, and in no hurry at all. Researchers at Yale, working with the genomes of American cavefish called amblyopsids, found something beautiful recently. By studying the specific genetic mutations that cause the degeneration of vision-related genes in these fish, they were able to build what they called a mutational clock, a way of estimating from the pattern of accumulated changes in the DNA how long ago those genes began to fade. For one species, the Ozark cavefish, the answer came back as perhaps 11 million years. There is another dimension to cave life that is only now beginning to be fully appreciated, and it begins not with the creatures we can see, but with the ones we cannot. Caves are full of microorganisms. Bacteria and archaea and fungi living in the walls and the water and the thin films of moisture on the stone, surviving in conditions that would kill most life within minutes. They are called extremophiles, lovers of the extreme, and they have been quietly solving the problem of survival in caves for far longer than any animal has. What makes them extraordinary, beyond their mere existence in such inhospitable places, is the chemistry they have developed to do it. In the competitive darkness of a cave where nutrients are scarce and every organism is fighting for the same thin resources, microorganisms have evolved a remarkable arsenal of chemical compounds, some to attack rivals, some to defend themselves, some to break down materials that nothing else can touch. And it turns out that some of these compounds are extraordinarily useful to us. The cave walls of Lechuguilla. When researchers collected samples and tested the bacteria against modern pathogens, they found that many of them produced compounds with antibiotic properties, compounds that modern medicine has never seen before. In an era when antibiotic resistance is one of the most serious challenges facing human health, the idea that caves might be quietly harboring the solutions is both humbling and quietly wonderful. More recently, in March of 2026, researchers working in a 13,000-year-old ice cave in Transylvania made a discovery that stopped them in their tracks. They found bacteria that were 5,000 years old, preserved in the ancient ice, dormant but viable. And when they were revived and tested, these bacteria were resistant to at least 10 modern antibiotics, including some that are considered drugs of last resort. The bacteria had developed their resistance, not in response to human medicine, but in response to each other. In the ancient underground competition that had been going on for millennia before we arrived. This tells us something important about the nature of antibiotic resistance. We tend to think of it as a modern problem, a consequence of our overuse of antibiotics in medicine and agriculture. And it is that, partly. But the resistance itself is ancient. The cave bacteria were already playing this game millions of years ago. The cave, it turns out, has always been a laboratory, running experiments in chemistry and survival that we are only now beginning to read. Dr. Roberto Anitori at Clark College has spent years working in the glacial-volcanic caves of Mount St. Helens, collecting samples from organisms living in conditions of near-total darkness and extreme cold in tunnels carved by ancient lava beneath a mountain that famously erupted not so long ago. The organisms he finds there have evolved in almost complete isolation, developing biochemical strategies that exist nowhere else. His work, ongoing for years, is aimed at identifying compounds that might become the next generation of antimicrobial agents, medicines drawn not from a laboratory, but from the patient darkness beneath a volcano. In the caves of the Dinaric region, that same limestone landscape where the Olm drifts through its century-long life, researchers have found microorganisms producing enzymes that can break down polyurethane, a type of plastic that is notoriously difficult to degrade. The cave has been quietly solving a problem we have only recently created in its own unhurried way. There is something worth sitting with in that. The idea that the darkness, which we so often associate with absence and emptiness, is in fact one of the most productive and inventive places on Earth. That below our feet, in the cold and the quiet, chemistry is happening that we have not yet learned to name. Prehistoric people seem to have had some intuitive sense of this. In many cave systems around the world, researchers have found evidence of ancient medicinal use of a white, chalky substance that forms on cave walls called moon milk, a soft, paste-like mineral deposit rich in microorganisms. People collected it and used it to treat wounds and infections long before they had any understanding of bacteria or chemistry. They knew somehow that the cave held something healing. They were not wrong. And then there is the question of what happens when a human being descends into the cave's darkness and stays. In 1938, a scientist named Nathaniel Kleitman, who would later become one of the most important figures in the history of sleep research, the man who helped discover rapid eye movement sleep, descended into Mammoth Cave in Kentucky with his graduate student, Bruce Richardson. They brought supplies for a month. They set up a camp in the cave's vast underground chambers, far from any natural light, and they began an experiment. The question they wanted to answer was simple. What happens to the human body's sense of time when the sun is taken away? Kleitman had spent years studying sleep. He was deeply curious about the internal clock that seemed to govern our waking and sleeping, our hunger and our alertness. He wanted to know whether that clock was truly internal, whether it would keep ticking without the external cue of light, or whether it would simply dissolve without the sun to anchor it. Down in the dark of Mammoth Cave, with no daylight and no natural time cues, the two men tried to shift their bodies onto a 28-hour day instead of the usual 24. Richardson, who was young, managed it. His body adapted to the new rhythm, his sleep and waking gradually shifting to match the longer cycle. Kleitman, who was older, could not make the shift. His body held stubbornly to its 24-hour pattern, even in the total absence of sunlight, cycling through alertness and drowsiness on its ancient schedule, regardless of what the clock in the cave said. It was a small experiment by modern standards, 2 people, 1 month. But it revealed something fundamental about the nature of our internal clocks, that they are real, that they persist even in darkness, and that they vary from person to person in ways that matter. Later cave isolation experiments, conducted by the French explorer Michel Siffre and others, pushed further into the same territory. Siffre spent months alone in caves, first in 1962 in a glacier cave in the Alps, then again in 1972 in a cave in Texas, with no clocks, no radio, no contact with the surface except a phone line he could use to report when he woke and when he slept. Without the sun to guide him, his internal clock began to drift. What researchers found across multiple subjects in multiple long isolation studies was that the human body, freed from the anchor of light, tends to slip into longer cycles. Many subjects naturally drifted toward what scientists call a circadian rhythm. Sleeping for 12 to 14 hours, then staying awake for 34 to 36 hours in a cycle that stretched toward 48 hours rather than 24. Their bodies were not broken. They were simply revealing something that the regular 24-hour cycle of the surface world keeps hidden. That our internal rhythms, left entirely to themselves, are longer and slower than we habitually live them. And what happened to their sleep during these extended cycles was interesting. When the sleep-wake cycle stretched out like this, the amount of time spent in deep sleep and in dream sleep, what we call REM sleep, increased. The body, given more time and less interference, went deeper. It rested more thoroughly. It spent longer in the slow, quiet brainwave states that are associated with restoration and memory and healing. The cave, in its patient darkness, was teaching the body to sleep properly. There is something in that which feels worth receiving quietly tonight. The idea that darkness is not an absence but an invitation. That when the light goes away and the external cues fade and the world stops asking things of you, the body knows exactly what to do. It has known for millions of years. It learned long before we had cities or calendars or screens casting their blue light into the small hours. The cave creatures understood this first. The Om hanging motionless in its cold dark water for years at a time. The bat folded into the silence of the cave ceiling, its heart beating 4 times a minute. The blind cavefish navigating its world through the feeling of water against its body, perfectly adapted to a place where the sun never comes. They are not waiting for the light to return. The dark is enough. The dark is home. There is one more detail about the cavefish that is worth carrying gently into sleep. Researchers at Florida Atlantic University, working recently with the blind Mexican cavefish, discovered something that seems counterintuitive at first, but makes perfect sense when you sit with it. When these fish are exposed to light, when light enters their dark cave world, they become more active. They move faster, they scatter, they swim away from it. This is the opposite of what their surface-dwelling relatives do. The riverfish, the sighted ones, become more active in darkness. They seek the light, so the cavefish moves away from it. deeper into the dark, towards safety. We are not so different, perhaps. When the screens go dark and the lights go out and the room grows quiet, something in us can recognize that this is not deprivation but protection. The darkness of a bedroom at night is the cave's gift, a signal to the body that it is safe now, that the exposed and effortful day is over, that it can go deep. The brain responds to darkness the way the cavefish does, not with fear when it is properly rested and properly cared for, but with relief. Melatonin rises. The heart rate slows. The brainwaves begin their long, gentle descent from the quick, busy frequencies of waking thought down through the softer rhythms of drowsiness, and then deeper still into the slow, vast waves of deep sleep. The cave of the mind, where restoration happens in the dark. Scientists who study sleep describe these deep waves as delta waves, the slowest of all, rolling through the brain at less than 4 cycles per second, like great slow swells on a very still ocean. They are associated with the most restorative sleep, the kind that repairs the body and consolidates memory and clears the brain of the metabolic waste products that accumulate during waking. They are the cave's equivalent of absolute dark, the deepest, quietest, most ancient part of the sleep landscape. You don't have to do anything to reach them. They come on their own, in the dark, when the body is allowed to follow its own unhurried path. The cave has been demonstrating this for 5 million years. In Romania, in the sealed dark of Movile, the water scorpions and the pale isopods are going about their lives right now, not waiting for morning, not counting the hours until light returns, simply living in the patient way that cave creatures live, in the total and absolute quiet of a world that has no use for clocks. In the Dinaric karst, in the cold underground rivers of Slovenia, an Olm is drifting. Perhaps the same one that was there last year and the year before and a decade before that. Moving so slowly through the water that it barely disturbs it, existing at the lowest possible volume, as if the cave has taught it that life does not need to be loud or fast or bright to be fully, beautifully alive. In Mammoth Cave, in the deep chambers where Kleitman and Richardson once lay in their camp beds listening to the silence, the darkness is still there, still absolute, still patient. It simply continues, the way it has always continued, still and dark and ancient and unhurried, keeping its own time in the deep of the earth. And somewhere beneath Mount St. Helens, in tunnels carved by ancient lava and filled now with slow cold air, bacteria are doing their quiet chemical work. Building compounds that have no name in any human language yet. Solving problems we haven't thought to ask about, in no hurry, with no awareness of the urgency that fills the surface world above them. The cave is the oldest kind of patience, the deepest kind of quiet, a reminder that the world does not end where the light does, that beyond the reach of the sun, something extraordinary has always been happening and is happening still in the slow dark at the bottom of the world. And so we leave it there, somewhere below you. If you imagine it, the earth goes down and down, through soil and root and stone, through the water table and the ancient rock, all the way to the caves, where the troglobites are navigating their perfect dark, and the Olm is drifting through its century, and the bacteria are writing their slow chemical sentences on the walls. You don't need to carry any of this with you into sleep. It will still be there in the morning and the morning after that. The caves are patient. They have been waiting for much longer than one night. The day is already far behind you now. Drift, if you're ready. Sleep well. There is a cave in the Slovenian karst called Postojna, and it has been drawing visitors for centuries. long enough that its oldest guestbook entries are written in languages that have since changed beyond recognition. Napoleon's soldiers visited, emperors visited, and all of them, standing at the entrance to its vast limestone chambers, reported the same thing, a feeling of being in the presence of something older than history, something that made the human story feel very brief. Postojna is home to the Olm, yes, but it is also home to something more unexpected, a beetle. The Leptodyrus hockenwort, discovered there in 1831 by a local guide named Luca Shea, who noticed it crawling across a cave wall by torchlight and brought it to the attention of a naturalist. It was the first cave-adapted animal ever formally described by science. The first creature to be documented as having evolved specifically for the underground world. Its discovery opened a door, not just a physical one, into the cave, but a conceptual one, into the understanding that caves were not simply empty spaces in the rock, but entire worlds with their own residents and their own rules. Leptodyrus is extraordinary to look at. Its body is elongated and narrow, adapted to squeezing through the tiny cracks and fissures in the limestone. Its legs are long and delicate. Its antennae are extravagant, vastly longer than its body, reaching out into the dark like slow, careful questions. It has no eyes at all, and it is pale, of course, the quiet pale of a creature that has never needed color. What Leptodyrus does in the cave is spend most of its life in the deepest, most inaccessible passages, in the zone of constant temperature and constant humidity that scientists call the deep cave zone. It rarely comes to the parts of the cave that humans visit. It is not hiding exactly. It is simply at home in the furthest, quietest reaches of its world, where even the faint disturbances of a cave tour do not reach. It eats organic matter that trickles down through the rock, the slow rain of decaying material from the surface, carried by water through the limestone over years and decades. It reproduces very slowly, laying single large eggs that take months to hatch. And it lives, by cave beetle standards, for an impressively long time. The cave's economy, always the same: slow down, invest deeply, waste nothing. The discovery of Leptodyrus hochenwort in 1831 did something important for science. It gave researchers a concrete example, a real creature they could hold in their hands and study, that proved the underground world was not a void but a habitat. Within decades, naturalists across Europe were exploring caves with new eyes, looking not just at the formations but at the life between them, and finding, almost everywhere they looked, that the dark was already occupied. There is a particular kind of silence in a cave that is worth describing because it is not quite like any other silence in the world. On the surface, even in the most remote wilderness, there is always something. Insects. Insects. But deep in a cave. Past the twilight zone near the entrance where daylight still faintly reaches, past the transition zone where the temperature begins to stabilize into what researchers call the dark zone. The silence is of a different quality entirely. It is not the absence of sound so much as the presence of something else, a thickness to the air, a sense that the quiet has weight and texture, that it has been accumulating in this chamber for so long it has become a substance. Cavers who have spent time in the deep dark zone often describe a curious effect. After a few hours without sound, the body begins to generate its own. A faint ringing in the ears as the auditory system, accustomed to a constant stream of input, begins to amplify the signals it does have. The sound of your own heartbeat becomes audible. Your breathing seems very loud. Some people report hearing what sounds like distant music, or voices, or a low hum. Not because anything is there, but because the brain, deprived of its usual sensory diet, begins to fill in the gaps. This is not the cave playing tricks. It is simply the brain revealing something about itself. It is not a passive receiver of information, but an active generator of experience, constantly predicting and interpreting and, when the input dries up, quietly inventing. The cave's silence holds up a mirror to the mind's own restless creativity. The darkness does something similar. True cave darkness. The kind where you hold your hand an inch from your face and see absolutely nothing, is genuinely disorienting at first. The visual cortex, which normally processes an enormous amount of information every second, finds itself with nothing to work with, and so it begins to work with what it has internally. Some people see geometric patterns, some see colors that seem to pulse or shift, some see nothing but feel a strong sense of presence, as though the darkness itself has a texture and a weight. Researchers studying sensory deprivation have found that even brief periods of total darkness and silence can produce measurable changes in perception and cognition. Some of these changes are pleasant, a deepening sense of calm, a slowing of thought, a feeling of spaciousness. Others are disorienting. It simply is what it is, and the human nervous system must find its own way of settling into that. The creatures that live there permanently have no such adjustment to make. For the pale cave cricket on the wall, for the blind crayfish in the stream, the dark is not a sensory deprivation chamber. It is simply the world. They have no memory of light to miss, no visual cortex sitting idle and searching for something to process. They are perfectly at home in the silence. The way you are perfectly at home in this room, in this dark, in this quiet hour. The slowness of cave life extends even to the way caves themselves are built. The great limestone cave systems of the world, Mammoth Cave in Kentucky, the Cockjean Caves in Slovenia, Lechuguilla in New Mexico, the Hang Son Doong system in Vietnam, were not carved quickly. They were carved by water, moving through cracks in soluble rock over periods of time that are genuinely difficult to hold in the mind. A millimeter of limestone dissolved per year, year after year, millennium after millennium. A passage that is 10 meters wide may have taken 1,000,000 years to reach that size. Hang Son Doong in the Phong Nha. It has its own jungle, growing in the places where the ceiling has collapsed and sunlight reaches the cave floor. Great green explosions of vegetation in the middle of the underground, dark, alive and bright and completely surrounded by stone. And it has its own river running through the cave floor, cold and clear and teeming with the pale, unhurried creatures of the deep. The first time a Western explorer entered Hang Son Doong in 2009, he reported standing in the main chamber and being unable to see the walls. The space was simply too large. His headlamp reached into the dark and found nothing. Just more dark, stretching away in every direction. He described it as standing inside the sky. The cave had been there in that condition for roughly 3 million years, waiting in its unhurried way to be noticed. The formations inside caves, the stalactites hanging from ceilings, the stalagmites rising from floors, the curtains and columns and flowstones and cave pearls are made by the same slow process. Water carrying dissolved calcium carbonate drips from the ceiling. A tiny fraction of a millimeter of mineral is deposited with each drop. Drop by drop, year by year, century by century, something grows. A stalactite that is 1 meter long may have taken 10,000 years to form. Some of the great columns in Lechuguilla Cave, where ceiling and floor formations have finally met and fused, are hundreds of thousands of years old. There is a cave pearl in a cave in China that is the size of a football. Researchers who calculated its growth rate estimated it had been forming for around 250,000 years, a perfect, smooth sphere built by water one molecule at a time in the patient dark, across a span of time that encompasses the rise and fall of multiple ice ages. These formations are not alive in the way the olm or the cave beetle is alive, but they share something with the cave's living residents. They too are the products of an extraordinary slowness. They too are the result of the cave's fundamental logic. When you have enough time, even the most incremental process can produce something astonishing. The relationship between caves and human beings goes back much further than science. It goes back to the very beginning of what we might recognize as human culture. The oldest known cave art in the world was made, as far as we can currently determine, somewhere between 45,000 and 65,000 years ago, in the caves of Sulawesi in Indonesia. A hand stencil. A pig painted on limestone walls in the deep interior of a cave far from the entrance in a place where there would have been no natural light at all. Whoever made these images carried fire with them into the dark. They went deliberately into the cave's interior and made something there, something that has survived for tens of thousands of years in the stable, unchanging conditions of the cave's deep zone. We don't know what it meant. We can never know exactly what moved a person to go deep into the earth with a torch and press their hand against the wall and blow pigment around it to leave a mark. But the fact that they did it, that the impulse to make art, to leave a trace, to say I was here in the dark, is itself remarkable. And the fact that the cave preserved it in its patient and unchanging way for 60,000 years feels like something more than accident. The Chauvet Cave in southern France, whose paintings were discovered in 1994, contains images of lions, rhinoceroses, bears, and horses, made approximately 36,000 years ago with a sophistication and a sense of movement that took the art world entirely by surprise. The animals are painted in perspective. They overlap each other. They are shown in motion, their legs multiplied to suggest running, their heads turned. Whoever made them understood how to suggest depth on a flat surface, how to convey life and speed in pigment on stone. These were not primitive scrawls. They were art in every meaningful sense of the word, made by people who carried their fire into the dark, who chose the cave's interior specifically because of what it offered. The still air, the constant temperature, the sense of enclosure and depth that the open surface world could not provide. The cave, for these artists, was not merely a shelter. It was a place set apart. A place where something different was possible. Some researchers have suggested that the acoustic properties of caves may have played a role in how certain chambers were chosen for painting. Researchers who have mapped the acoustic properties of painted caves like Lascaux and Nyon in France have found a striking correlation. The areas with the most paintings tend to be the areas with the most interesting acoustic properties. The places where sound behaves in unexpected ways, where a voice or a drum or a hand clap produces a resonance that seems to come from the stone itself. Whether the ancient artist chose these spots because of the sound, or whether the coincidence is simply that. A coincidence cannot be known for certain. But the possibility is worth holding gently. The idea that the people who first made art in the deep of the earth were also listening to the cave, paying attention to the way it answered back, finding in its resonances something that mattered to them in ways we can only imagine. The cave was not simply a canvas, it was a participant. Long after Kleitman and Richardson packed up their camp and returned to the surface, Mammoth Cave continued its own quiet experiments in time. It has been doing so, in fact, for around 10 million years, which is the age of the oldest passages in its system. The cave is the longest known cave system in the world, with more than 670 kilometers of mapped passages. And researchers believe there may be as much, again still undiscovered, still waiting in the dark beneath Kentucky for someone to find the way through. The cave's name is something of a misnomer. It does not contain mammoth bones, or not primarily. The name comes from an older sense of the word mammoth, meaning simply enormous, vast, beyond ordinary scale. And it is. Walking through its great corridors, past chambers with names like the Rotunda and the Chief City and the Star Chamber, a person feels the particular smallness that comes from being in the presence of something that has been here for an almost incomprehensible length of time and will be here long after everything we have built on the surface has returned to dust. Stephen Bishop was a man who knew Mammoth Cave as well as anyone has ever known it. He was an enslaved man, brought to the cave in the 1830s as a guide, and over the years he mapped and explored its passages with a thoroughness and a courage that left the cave's owners far behind. He crossed underground rivers on slippery ledges with only a lantern, discovered chambers no one had seen before, and drew from memory a map of the cave that remained the most accurate available for decades after his death. He named many of the cave's features: Bottomless Pit, the Snowball Room, Gorin's Dome. He gave the cave its human vocabulary. Bishop died in 1857, having spent much of his life in the cave's particular dark. He understood it in a way that was physical and intimate, the way you understand a place you have moved through with your body in the absence of easy light. He once said, when asked about the cave, that he had seen enough of it for 3 lifetimes. But there is something in the record of his work, the maps he made, the chambers he named, the routes he found through the dark, that suggests something more than weariness, a knowledge, a relationship with the underground that was genuinely its own. The cave rewarded that attention. It kept its secrets long enough to be worth finding, and then it yielded them, one passage at a time, to someone who was patient enough to look. There is a researcher named Annette Summers Engel who has spent years studying the microbial mats that line the walls and pools of sulfuric acid caves. Caves like Lechuguilla and Villa Luz in Mexico, where hydrogen sulfide rises from below and creates an environment that is chemically extreme by almost any measure. These caves are carved not by the slow dissolution of limestone by rainwater, as most caves are, but by sulfuric acid produced when hydrogen sulfide meets oxygen in the presence of bacteria. The bacteria are, in a very real sense, eating the cave into existence. They are building their world by dissolving the rock around them, very slowly, over geological time. Engel's work in these caves has found microbial communities of extraordinary diversity, organisms adapted to conditions of high acidity, low oxygen, and the constant presence of toxic gases. And within these communities, she has found evidence of metabolic processes that have no equivalent in the surface world, pathways for generating energy from chemical reactions that surface organisms have never needed to develop. Because the surface world offers easier options, the cave, in its chemical extremity, has been an engine of biochemical invention. The organisms living in it have been solving problems for millions of years that we are only now beginning to understand how to pose. It is easy, lying here in the dark, to think of the underground world as simply the absence of the surface world, as what is left when you take away the light and the warmth and the open sky. But that framing has it backwards. The cave is not a diminished version of the surface. It is its own complete thing, ancient and inventive and full, in its quiet way, of exactly the kind of life it has always needed. The pale isopod navigating the sulphurous water of Movile does not experience its world as lacking. The Olm drifting through its cold, dark river does not know that it is missing anything. The cave beetle, pressing its long antennae against the limestone wall and reading the faint vibrations in the stone, is not waiting for a better world to arrive. This world, this still, dark, patient world, is sufficient. It is, in every way that matters, enough.